Tonight, let's imagine that you wanted to build a house. You don't know much about building, but you know that you need cement and lumber and nails and plumbing and electrical materials. So you go to the store, you go to the building supply store, and you buy a bunch of those items and you take them to your property. You start sawing and nailing boards together. You start stringing out electrical wires around the house, and you begin putting pipes and plumbing together. If your finished product was anything more than a ramshackle lean-to, you would be lucky. What you lack is a plan or a blueprint. If you want to build a house, you need a blueprint which shows the design and the necessary materials. No one in their right mind would consider building a house without a blueprint. Everyone would agree that the structure called a house is not nearly as important as the relationships that we call a home. And yet, while we wouldn't think of building a house without a blueprint, many people go about building their homes with no idea of God's plan. It doesn't make sense. And the result, all too often, is a ramshackle, lean-to type of family life. Psalm 128 shows us God's blueprint for building a satisfying home. Not only a satisfying home, but a godly home. Let's read Psalm 128 together tonight. It says this, "Blessed is everyone that feareth the Lord, that walketh in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labor of thine hands. Happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, thy children like olive plants round about thy table. Behold, that thus shall the man be blessed that feareth the Lord. The Lord shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel." That's Psalm 128. And what we see here is that God's blessing in the family is based on the fear of the Lord. A godly home is based upon the fear of the Lord. Psalm 128 is showing us an ideal situation here. But we know that we don't live in an ideal world. Some homes, they've been ripped apart by divorce. And maybe a single mom is trying to hold everything together. Others, they're living in mixed marriages where the husband is resistant to the gospel and the wife is trying her best to provide spiritual training for her children. If your family is far from the ideal, don't freak out or become upset. It doesn't mean that God won't bless you. Whatever your situation, God wants you to fear Him and to walk in His ways. But just because we can't totally follow the ideal, let's not scrap the plan. It's like throwing a pebble in a calm lake. Psalm 128, it begins with a godly man as the head of his home, and it ripples out to his wife, then to the children. And finally, it shows the effect of this godly home on the nation. Now, I'm going to follow this simple progression in teaching through this psalm tonight. And the first thing that we see in the blueprints that we've been given is leadership in the home, there in verses 1 and 2. And well, you've probably noticed that God did not inspire the psalmist along today's politically correct lines. In our American society, seeing the man as the head of the family is not the correct thing. But in both the Old and the New Testaments, God's directives for the family, well, they're given to the man as the spiritual leader. And so this psalm, it's addressed to the man of the family. How do you lead your family spiritually? You know, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is it's easy to lead. Kids follow your example. But that's also the bad news. You see, we can't escape being examples to our children, either for good or for bad. Do we live out our Christianity in our attitudes, our words, and our actions while we're in our home? Do our kids see the fruit of the Spirit in us, especially when we're under pressure? You see, a great deal of what our kids learn about everyday life, it comes from watching our examples as fathers, as dads. And that's pretty scary, isn't it? You know, studies have shown that children raised in the home with a father that makes God a priority, they will continue. They're 3 times more likely to continue a pursuit of a spiritual relationship with God throughout their life. They're 3 times more to do this than kids who didn't grow up in that environment. A godly man will lead his family in fearing the Lord. This is an attitude of respect and reverence that it results in actions of obedience. The fear of the Lord, it stems from knowing Him. Now, some people, they may fear God in an unhealthy sense, that it causes them to avoid Him because they don't really know Him. But we fear other things because we do know them. I fear my power saw because I know the terrible damage that it can cause if I get careless and I put my hand in the wrong place in front of the blade. Now that fear doesn't cause me to avoid my saw. Instead, it teaches me to respect my power saw. The proper fear of the Lord, it stems from understanding God. Understanding His greatness, His power, and His absolute holiness. Our God is an eternal God who spoke the entire universe into existence. The fear of the Lord, it results in obedience to Him. Verse 1 tells us that the man who fears God walks in His ways. Now, if we're growing in the knowledge of God, we'll be growing in the fear of God as well. To grow in the fear of God means to grow in holiness and to flee from evil. When we're tempted to sin, even if no one else is watching, we will remember that God is always watching. Fearing God, it will cause us to walk in His ways as it is revealed in His Word. In terms of home life, a man who fears God will not use His name in vain. He won't joke about God or His Word. He will clear his home of any trashy magazines. He won't watch filthy, trashy TV shows or videos. He'll take the initiative in leading his family in reading God's Word, in prayer, and in a commitment to church life and ministry. The fear of God, it's also a practical thing that affects all aspects of life. Verse 2 tells us that the man who fears God will eat of the labor of his hands. Now this means that he is a hard worker, whether on his job or at home. I'm not talking about overworking, but rather about an attitude toward work. The man who fears God, well, he's not lazy. By his example and his attitude, he shows his children the positive value of work, and he motivates them to use their lives productively. A man who fears God will use his own time productively. The fear of God, well, it also affects our emotional state and our attitude toward life. Verse 2 also tells us, you will be happy and it will be well with you. You see, the man who fears God, he's content. He isn't griping about how hard life is or complaining about all of the bad breaks that he has received. He isn't grumbling about how hard he has worked. He's happy. It is well with him. He's a cheerful, pleasant man to live with. This man's happiness doesn't come from circumstances. His joy is in the Lord. And as men, we lead our families by example. At the very heart of our example, we need to be growing in the fear of the Lord. It's a process. But my question is, are you involved in the process? You need to daily be growing in your knowledge of God through His Word and seeking to make His ways your ways. A man who fears God is at the center of God's blueprint for a satisfying life, a satisfying and godly home. The second part of the blueprint is faithfulness in the home. We see this in the first part of verse 3. Now, there in verse 3, she is described as a fruitful vine within your house. Now, fruitfulness is the main thought in the figure of the vine. The main purpose of a grapevine is to bear fruit. Now, there are probably two senses of fruitfulness that are referred to here: childbearing and productivity. The Hebrews, they saw children as a blessing from God. And we should view every child's birth as a blessing directly from Him. This godly wife's fruitfulness, it refers not only to bearing children, but also to her productivity. A fruitful vine is in that hot Middle Eastern climate, it produced something refreshing and nourishing for other people. If you're a wife and mother, you're not supposed to be lazy, self-centered. You're not supposed to be a woman who spends her days in front of the TV. But she will be productive. She will do her best to provide for her home, nourishing her children and her family. The fruitful vine, it points to the joy this woman brings to her home. A godly wife and mother will make sure that her home is an enjoyable place to be. You see, this godly woman is not only fruitful, well, she's also faithful in the home. This part of verse 3 says, within your house. Now, the Hebrew word for within is a strong word that means the innermost part. A godly wife and mother has a commitment to her family, as seen by the fact that she is within her house. She's faithful to her husband, to her children, and to her home. But she is also faith-filled. She will be just as in study of her Bible as her husband. She will be in pursuit of the spiritual relationship with God that she should be. And she will be faithful in her attention to sharing God's glories and her home with other people. So, a godly home. It will have a man who leads his family in the fear of the Lord, and a woman who is fruitful and faithful in the home. But there's a third part to the blueprint. It's the legacy of the home. We see that in the rest of verse 3 and the first part or all of verse 4. You see, the blueprint for a satisfying home includes children described as olive plants around the table. These are not mature trees, but little sprouts that grow up around a mature olive tree. They may someday replace the parent, continuing to bear fruit after that they're gone. Now, there are two implications here as well. First, the children are developing. They're not perfect. They have potential for fruitfulness, but they're not there yet. They need time to develop and to mature in the nourishing soil of this God-fearing home. They need to be allowed to make mistakes without rejection. They need to be allowed to develop according to their own unique, God-given characteristics and desires. Christian parents, we sometimes blow it. We make mistakes because Christian parents often err because they have high standards for their kids, which is a good thing. But they demand perfection and they don't give the kids real room to grow. Sometimes we want our kids to be perfect because it makes us to look good as Christian parents. But none of us are perfect parents. And we don't have perfect kids. We ought to be growing together as a family in the Lord's ways. The second implication of the olive plant is our children require nurture, care, and patience. A tree doesn't bear fruit overnight. It takes a lot of tender, loving care, protection, weeding, watering, and feeding before there is fruit. Now that's the picture here of the children being nurtured toward fruitfulness as they mature in years. Look at verse 4. It says that thus shall the man or the home be blessed. It's when we raise our children in the model of God, with the fear of God, to become children of God, that we are truly blessed. It's when we have followed and allowed the architect's blueprints to be chief in our life, when we followed them to the smallest of measurements, and we have provided everything necessary to our young olive sprouts, that they are then able to mature, move on in life, and become our true legacy. So, God's blueprint begins with a God-fearing man. It ripples out to a fruitful, faithful woman, and then it ripples still further to growing and eventually fruitful children. But what is the end result of this process? Fruitfulness of the home. We see that in verses 5 and 6. And there, personal well-being is described in the first parts of verses 5 and 6, and national well-being in the second part of those verses. The man pictured here, he's happy. He's a happy old man enjoying God's blessing as he sees his grandchildren following after the Lord. Now, in contrast, a man who pursues financial success without any regard for his home, he will end up with poverty in his soul. A man who follows God's blueprint for the home, he will end up with prosperity in his soul. And the family is the building block of the neighborhood, the building block of the city, the state, and in our nation. The turmoil that's all around our nation today can be traced back to the turmoil in our homes. If we want to see our nation turn around, we must start within our homes. We must follow God's blueprint by becoming men and women who fear the Lord and walk in His ways, teaching our children by our example to grow up in the fear of the Lord. There was not long ago a study of two different families, and this study revealed some pretty startling results. One family descended from a man named Max Jukes, and this man did not follow the Lord, nor did his wife. Among the over 1,200 descendants that were studied, 310 were vagrants. 440 physically wrecked their lives through abuse, sin, or uncleanness. Many of them went to prison. 7 were murderers. 100 were alcoholics. 60 were professional thieves. 190 were prostitutes. And of the 20 that actually went on to learn a trade, 10 of them learned that while they were in prison. Over the years, this family cost the state of New York several $million. Now, the second family studied was that of Jonathan Edwards, the New England preacher, and his godly wife Sarah. Among his descendants, 300 became pastors, missionaries, or theological professors. Over 100 became college professors. Over 100 became lawyers, including 30 judges. Over 60 became physicians and doctors. 14 became presidents of universities. 3 became United States congressmen. And 1 became the vice president of the United States. 2 families. 1 major difference. The Edwards family had followed the blueprints for building a godly home. The Jukes family, they did not. The fruitfulness of our home is directly dependent on our dependence on God. The fruitfulness of our home and its eventual impact on our nation's future, it's dependent upon our intentional obedience to following God's blueprint for our lives. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in building a house that is bound to fall under the weight of the first storm that comes along. I want to build a home that stands the test of time. I want to build a godly home for my family, a home that eventually bears much good fruit. Do you? You see, the outcome depends upon our following God's blueprint, given to us here in Psalm 128. A satisfying home is based on God's blessing. God's blessing is based on the fear of the Lord, and our faithfulness to God dictates our fruitfulness. Is your home being built on the fear of the Lord? is your home, a godly home where the architect himself would find peace and rest? It will only ever be this way if we take the time to study the blueprints.